She was this gun-toting, whiskey-drinking broad.
The super epic fucking broad.
She was a pioneer in the industry.
She's also so famous and so controversial.
So controversial.
So she's kind of a big fucking deal.
Her story is so incredible. She belongs on this podcast because she's a broad you should know. Hello and welcome to Broads You Should Know, the podcast about amazing and noteworthy women from history. I am your host, Sarah Gorski, and I am joined again today by our guest, Miss Amelia Hamill. Hi, Amelia. Thank you for joining me again.
Of course. This is where I want to be, man.
We had such a great episode with you last week talking about Harriet Tubman, one of the most iconic broads, one of the most iconic Black broads in U.S. history, for sure.
For sure.
And I wanted to bring you back and talk about another amazing, and she's not as iconic because I don't think her name is well known, but she's a really important broad, I feel like, in the discussions about the bullshit, the white on black bullshit that our country has, propagated over and over again through the centuries. Have you ever heard of Carrie Johnson?
Oh, interesting. No, I don't think I actually have.
So I've seen her name come up like a few times. Like when you Google around for like, when you do things like I do, like Google amazing Black women and you see all these listicles because that's, our society's built on listicles right now, or at least our generations are. Her name comes up a lot. But she's not very famous and a lot of people don't know her story. And I think it's because a lot of people don't actually know a lot of kind of the race riot history in this country.
Oh, okay.
I remember like when, what was it, like 3 or 4 years ago, that show came out. Oh my God, I'm like blanking out right now on the name of it. But it part of the show was like, it like opened on the Tulsa race riots. And I remember being like, what the fuck? This is part of American history? How come nobody told me about the Tulsa race riots? They're huge and they're hugely disturbing period in American history.
But you're right. Most of us didn't hear about it till we were adults.
No. And even then it's like this TV show, this comic book TV show. It was the one with Regina King. I can't remember the name of the show. I'm totally blanking on it. Watchmen.
Oh, sure. And so I
couldn't think of the title.
The movie, but I never actually watched the show. So.
But the show like started with a whole scene in the Tulsa race riots. And I just remember like my mind was, I was like staring at the screen, mouth open for like the entire hour-long episode. Like it was just so disturbing to know that was a part of American history and that it's part of American history that isn't really widely taught. And like, I feel like there's a number of people in this country, a huge population of folks who pretend like racism is over. I think that's harder to say now because we have some like very aggressive racism resurfacing. But like, I think a lot of people for a long time were like, oh, it's kind of over. And like, it hasn't been a thing since slavery, since the Civil War. And that is not fucking true.
No, it's not true in the least.
There has been a lot of really terrible things, that are the Jim Crow laws, which basically extended slavery, enslavement of Black folks in this country, and a lot of other bullshit came with that. So Carrie Johnson, her story takes place in Washington D.C. In 1919, and
that's when my grandmother was born.
Really?
Yeah.
Is she still around today?
She's not. She passed away in the 80s. But rest
in peace, Grandma. That's amazing you know that. I don't know the year my grandmother was born. I'm impressed with you, Amelia.
That was the most ridiculous thing.
Okay, so we're in 1919 in Washington, D.C. And so I didn't know very much about 1919. So I'm going to just give us all, I'm going to assume most of us are as ignorant as me, and I'm going to give us a little bit of background. The president in this time period is Woodrow Wilson. I didn't know very much about Woodrow Wilson, Amelia. Do you know anything about him?
I mean, I would love to say yes, but probably not.
Well, I didn't know much about him. And here's the short version that's relevant to our story, because obviously he had a long career and did many things. But Woodrow Wilson was a racist piece of shit. And when he took office, he had ordered the segregation of races at the Treasury Department and the U.S. Post Office. So since the Civil War, Black people and white people were integrated. And then Woodrow Wilson was like, no, actually, let's stay segregated. So the Treasury, Interior, and State Departments had like Black bathrooms and white bathrooms and all of that fucking shit. Now, I didn't know this. So I'm like, in my research, I'm like, my fury level like immediately spikes, right?
Oh, of course.
He was apparently a Southern guy and a Southern racist. And in this period of time, Washington, D.C. is kind of considered more of a Southern town than it is a Northern one. I feel like today we consider it part of the North, but
I know, but I can see that just because like Maryland was part of the South, and
yeah, it's like right there. A lot of shit happened right. Isn't the Mason-Dixon line? Isn't it like not that far? I don't even remember. I'm a terrible historian. So, but he basically rolled back a bunch of progress immediately. Like immediately upon taking office in 1913, he rolled back a ton of these more quote progressive. I'm putting it in quote marks because I don't even believe I have to call it that, but I guess I have to in that framework. And no one was happy about this, and historically speaking, there was like a huge number of Black men that went and fought for the U.S. in World War I.
Absolutely.
And when they came back and in World War I and in Europe, they did not experience like the virulent racism that was happening here. And so when they came back from World War I and they're dealing with all of these like these segregation laws and all this racism, it was very much not a reverse culture shock, but like it was infuriating because it's like they had seen how it wasn't like that other places, and they were like, oh yeah, actually it doesn't have to be this way. So why is it this way? And people were more activated, I guess, to say about what had been going on in the country. And there is this summer, the summer of 1919, apparently there's a poet named James Weldon Johnson. He was a poet and an activist, and he was also a field secretary for the NAACP. And a reminder, NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, right? He called the summer of 1919 the Red Summer in the United States. It was a season of blood in America. And from April to November of 1919, the U.S. experienced a huge number of, quote, race wars all across the United States. There were riots in 26 cities at least. There were record number of lynchings. By the end of that specific year, 76 Black men would be lynched, which was the most in a decade. And most of these riots were white mobs getting like uppity about fake crimes that Black people were accused of committing. Like maybe some of them were real, but most of them were like newspapers, like the equivalent of today's clickbait, right? Where like, let's put a big headline to sell more papers. These like white newspapers would put these shocking headlines about white men attacking or Black men attacking white women. And then suddenly the white people in the town are like pulling Black people out of their houses. And like this was happening across the United States. So, racism is not pre-Civil War history. This is 1919. This is your grandmother's time. This is the period your grandmother lived in, and my grandmother too. So in Washington, unfortunately, did not escape the Red Summer. It wasn't much different. And specifically, the particular race riot that happens in Washington in 1919 that is part of Carrie Johnson's story, it was really incited by two different newspapermen. One was named Calvin Chase, and one was Ned McLean. And Ned McLean was a rich piece of shit. His wife apparently had like bought the Hope diamond. amongst other shitty things that they did. The Hope Diamond being like the largest diamond, right? Isn't that like the largest?
Yeah. I hope she
Oh,
choked on it.
they got divorced is all I know. And there's this like silly picture of the two of them with this like ridiculously groomed poodle.
Oh,
And
I'm
it's
sure.
just like, I was like, of course
The only
this is the
thing
people.
more disgusting than, bigoted rich white people from now is bigoted rich white people from history. Like,
Yeah.
I
And
feel like
in fact, maybe they're the same people.
I mean, they're definitely probably like ancestors.
And so, okay, so Calvin Chase was a black man. So his paper was black. He was from a free black family. They had been free for generations. Very well educated. And he took over his newspaper, the Washington D.C. And he had been writing for a really long time. Ned McClain, the white piece of shit, he was a publisher of the Washington Post at the age of 30, nonetheless.
I know, that's
He inherited
shocker.
it from his daddy.
Of course he did.
He inherited it from his daddy, and a vast fortune, and all these other things. And so basically, what happens is the racial tension is happening all over the country, and it's more or less kind of in the air everywhere. And Calvin Chase is like, like maybe we can, maybe we can drum up some interest in the paper. Maybe we can take advantage of this racial tension, and let's publish some explosive news. And so they started to like post a bunch of rumors, stories, which now I'm calling rumors because they obviously weren't real stories, about white men being sexually assaulted by black men. And on July 9th, the NAACP was sending letters, and they basically were calling them out and being like, these stories have no basis and foundation. What are you doing? And they just ignored it, and they kept publishing. And then on July 15th, a couple days later, the Post, one of the other Washington papers, described another incident in an amusement park where two black men allegedly pulled a gun on a white woman and assaulted her. Later, that woman recanted the story. But 2 days later, the Washington Times, which was another white paper, carried this front page headline, "Another girl is attacked here." And basically the tinderbox that had been kind of building really explodes. And police were rounding up black men, and like black men like not even close to where the alleged crimes were happening. It was like any black man could be suspect, rounding them up with no, like, all of this is like highly illegal, or should have been highly illegal. I don't know at the time like what the literal laws on the books were. But the city just kind of devolves into insanity. But the city also like had a pretty healthy black population. It wasn't like all white people and just a few black people. And so black people also like were they were not just like running and hiding. They were like fighting back and standing up for their houses, and they were like throwing bricks at policemen who are coming to arrest people and stuff like that. And I hate to like even say that out loud, like, I don't want to make it, there's a fine line, and we're both white people. We have to acknowledge that, right? And we're talking about really important incidents specifically for Black history. But it wasn't like Black people getting mad at white people. The white people instigated it, and Black people fought back and defended themselves. And for me, I find, I see no crime, right? Like, you're being attacked and you defend yourself.
Decided that they were going to send in like stormtroopers into my building, I would defend my neighbors.
So anyway, this whole incident kind of takes place over the course of a week, where the whole city was just kind of like devolved into this. And in the middle of all this, we have Ben Carson and his 17-year-old daughter Carrie. And they lived in a neighborhood that was very mixed race. Like, it wasn't specifically one or the other, but those kinds of neighborhoods were also some of the most like racially tense neighborhoods, because you had everybody, all mixed around together.
Yeah.
And Ben, they weren't idiots. They knew what was going on. And Ben obtained a .38 caliber rifle so that he could defend himself if someone like came into their house or something. Like, in the midst of all these riots, you want to defend yourself, right? But they apparently were like holed up in their apartment, and they weren't out on the streets. They weren't inciting anything. They really just were like, let's just stay inside and not be part of whatever this craziness is and try to defend ourselves. But in the meantime, outside of their apartment, Black residents were on the roofs of their houses, and they were throwing rocks at some of the white people who had gathered trying to like arrest or harass Black people, right? And apparently there was a musician coming back from a late night gig who heard somebody shout, "Get the N-word." I'm not going to say the N-word. I don't like to do that. I don't think we should. And then a brick hits a police officer in the head. And then gunshots erupt into the middle of all of this. And pretty quickly, a car full of like white men come rolling up right next to the alley next to the Johnson's house. And there was more gunfire. And some police arrive. And within minutes, there's like 2 army trucks and a dozen Marines. And they're kind of like all around the neighborhood. And there's some people on the ground that say, hey, a bunch of shots came from the second floor of that building. Now, that building that they pointed to was the building that Ben and Carrie were hiding in. And so what basically happens is that the police raid the apartment, and they're looking around and they don't find anybody. Like Carrie and Ben were hiding under the bed. And one of the detectives, Detective Wilson was his name, is like, no, there's got to be somebody here. And he like gets down on the floor, looks under the bed, and a shot rings out from under the bed. And the other police officers pull out Carrie from under the bed and her dad. A whole bunch of gunfire rings out, first of all. The police officers shoot the hell out of him. Carrie has a bullet hole in her leg, 17-year-old Carrie. Her dad was shot as well. But the gun apparently was laying next to Carrie, and she was the one who fired the gun at the detective.
Sure.
The detective who was there investigating the quote crimes that were happening in that apartment. And this detective ends up dying. And Carrie and her dad are both arrested. And they are taken to trial separately. At the end of all the riots, by the way, compared to other race riots that were happening in this time period, in Washington at this week, at the end of it, 5 Black men were killed and 4 white men, which was actually a relatively low number compared to some of the other cities where riots were happening. But hundreds of men and women had been arrested. Many were injured. There were tons still in the jails. And the fallout for this, I'm not going to go into like all of the rest of that, but that's like, I needed to give you guys the context for what happened. So Carrie and her dad are both charged with first-degree murder, and they are held in a D.C. jail for the next 18 months. And there's the U.S. Attorney General at the time, John Lasky, and his prosecutors were preparing for the trial. So this was like U.S. Attorney General, well, it was Washington, D.C., I guess, so that makes sense. But at the very beginning of all of it, the Black community really rallied around Carrie to try to help her and Ben out. Ben, her dad, by the way, was a Mason. So he was part of that huge Mason community that had been around for, hundreds of years. They're very, very well established. And at first, she was being described as kind of a little heroine, our Joan of Arc, our Charlotte Corday. Charlotte Corday, by the way, we haven't done her on this podcast, but she was a French revolutionary, and she assassinated the Jacobin leader, Jean-Paul Marat. I haven't covered that. She's about.
I know. I was going to say. Now we know what we're working on.
But there was a quote from the guy that was defending her that said, quote, Carrie Johnson faced death like a little rabbit in a corner, fired upon point blank by Officer Wilson and others. And he put together like a fashion show to help raise some money for her to cover her legal expenses. And they raised $1,300, which back then is a lot of money. And he kind of had this whole, like, he really was playing up kind of the self-defense of Carrie's story, that the police had like come into their apartment, guns blazing, and she was just defending herself. But apparently at the same time, all these things are moving potentially in a good direction for Carrie. Um, her dad turns against her. Ben was facing the death penalty for his crimes. And then he agrees to testify against Carrie. And then in November of 1920, he's released on $200 bond, and he's listed as a witness for the government in Carrie's trial, which I was not able to find more research about how that went down and why that went down. I imagine part of it was like trying to avoid the death penalty part of it and thinking that,
I'm sure.
But anyway, so his trial happened first, and then he was released as a witness, and then Carrie's trial has come to pass. And her dad has gotten off the hook, which like really makes her look like the guilty one. Whether or not that was how it should have been, like that's how it looks, right, in the eyes of the law, and all that. And the news stories started to kind of shift against her, and the people who'd been like rallying for her kind of at the beginning seemed to kind of disappear. The fundraising disappeared, and she didn't have a lot of support, but she did have one particular guy, Reverend William Jernigan, who was a Baptist preacher and president of the National Race Congress. He came to her defenses, as well as a veteran attorney, Benjamin Gaskins. And he had a long history with a family of doctors and lawyers and professionals, and he took over her case after kind of the earlier arguments and the earlier case that was building kind of fell apart with the shift of her dad, right? And then in January 1921, a jury of 12 white men, they hear the case U.S. versus Carrie Johnson for murder in the first degree. And the government called in a dozen police officers to testify. Ben Johnson did not apparently testify against her, which a slight relief, even though ultimately
it's interesting. Though. I wonder what happened there.
Yeah, I don't feel like I wish I had more time to research and see if I could dig it out. But in the initial articles I read, that was that's all I know. And then there was this like really decisive moment in the trial when her lawyer argued that Carrie had acted in self-defense. And the assistant U.S. attorney objected and was like, this girl doesn't have anything to fear from our men invading her home. And he's like, quote, in a corner of a dark room, back of a bed, the defendant occupied a position of comparative safety.
Absolutely.
End quote. Quote oh no, wait, it's not the end of the quote. There's more. Quote, it can hardly be seriously contended that it was anything in the language or conduct of the 4 detectives in the room or before they had entered it to engender in the mind of the defendant a reasonable belief that she was in imminent danger. That's the end of the quote. Fucking insane. Like yeah. 4 white cops like blazing into the room. Oh my God. I just can't. But I also think there's something to be said for the fact that like the argument of self-defense was like a white person's argument, right? Yeah,
absolutely.
Like that's what was at the heart of it, right?
Like she had nothing to fear.
Yeah. And then on top of all this other bullshit, after the witnesses were all done testifying, the prosecutor pulls some extra bullshit. It's not enough bullshit already. There's extra bullshit where he like announces to the jury. So the jury's not supposed to know the trial or what's really going on, right? That's part of jury selection generically and has been for a really long time. But in front of the jury, the prosecutor's like, oh, by the way, the charges against her dad were dropped. And like that's
insane.
And the judge was like so. No, actually, her defense lawyer objected and was overruled. But the jury heard it and the damage is done, right? And it makes Carrie look guilty, even though it has literally nothing to do with her trial. It's literally a totally separate thing, right?
Yeah.
And so the jury convenes, and they do, after a brief deliberation, apparently, they do convict Carrie, but they do not convict her for first-degree murder. And in what was very unusual, and I don't even know if this is allowed anymore, they return a verdict of manslaughter instead of first-degree murder. And the difference is manslaughter was not a capital crime. So even though it was a white jury for the trial of a black girl, let's call her a girl, she's 17, they did at least have like a little whatever shred of sympathy that would take her, making it not a capital crime means she can't get the death penalty for it, right? So her lawyer asks for bail, and the judge sets bond at $5,000, which is about the equivalent of $75,000 today. And the Reverend puts the money up for her. Thank God, like he was there. And she's out on bail. And the case kind of continues to weaken, and they file for like a retrial, right? They want to have a new trial enacted. The evidence is so weak, like a week, and the government's case like keeps getting weaker and weaker. And finally, the U.S. attorney just drops the charges.
Oh, thank God! But still.
So on June 21st. There's a really tiny, tiny story. Of course, it was tiny. On an inside page of the Post, which read, "Released in riot killing, Carrie Johnson, colored, freed in death of Detective Wilson." So Carrie was released, and she, I don't have much more about what happened to her after this.
But how scary. I mean, especially in those kind of times, especially when the world around you seems to be devolving and
Yes.
people are supposed to believe that this girl, like you said, definitely 17-year-old girl, isn't terrified by 4 detectives, like, after her dad told her to hide under a bed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like in the research I was reading, there was like varied accounts of what happened that night, right? When the cops went in, and like some of the accounts were like they shot first, and so she shot in self-defense, and some were like they didn't shoot first. They were just your neighborhood friendly detectives.
Oh yeah.
And in the light of all the things that as a country we've experienced in the last 5-6 years, it's. Like, yeah. I don't trust anything the police say. Like, and I know that there are good police officers. I have some cousins that are police officers who are great police officers. Like,
of course, but there's also the evil ones.
And there's also a brotherhood, right? There's also like, even if other people in the room don't know that that's not true, like that there's a huge defense of, especially in history. And I'd like to think that's shifting now with the invention of, body cams. I'd like to think that. I obviously, we still see lots of examples where that's not true, but.
Or they figure out how to unplug them. I mean,
Yeah, but I just can't even imagine, like, I try not to get emotional on the podcast, but I always do. Like, I try to imagine, like, 17-year-old Carrie, like, these men coming into her house and thinking that she's going to be killed. And not even, you don't know they're even detectives. They just barge their way in. And like when I was 17, like your brain's not fucking developed.
Well, no. And then dad saying like, go over here, be quiet, whatever, like we don't know what the conversation was.
And with bricks flying outside of your window and with, rioting happening everywhere and people dying and like, I don't know, like, I just feel a lot of emotions for a fucking 17-year-old girl stuck in the middle of it.
Absolutely.
And then who's brought to a capital trial, a capital murder trial.
Especially in those days, I mean.
And maybe you could, like, maybe someone can say it was all an accident and that the cops weren't going to shoot at them, but it just doesn't fucking matter. Like, these things never should have happened. And she never should have had to go to capital trial as a 17-year-old. And like whatever happened with her dad and that's all, it's a whole separate ball of shit. But anyway, what an interesting time period. And I did not know about the Red Summer and all of these things that went down.
I've heard that term before, so that really is interesting to me. I mean, I knew that there were times when the violence was worse and all of those other things, but I had never heard it described as that. You know?
How terrifying. How fucking terrifying. I mean, I get terrified when I like learn more about the LA riots that happened like only in the 90s, right? That was in both of our lifetimes.
Absolutely.
And like you can still see the scars of it, like sometimes, and there are people who live here now that were like lived through that and had their stores ransacked and burned and all this stuff, and like how fucking scary mob mentality and rioting is, like at its real heart. And man, I wish times were different. I like wish this wasn't still happening. Like, why would this still even fucking happens? I don't even know. And it seems to be like it's not even just the U.S. it happens in. It happens other places too.
No,
but,
I mean we see horrible things happening all over the world,
but it's important, I think, for us to tell these stories and for us to know, like, you know, a frustrating thing for me as a white person is to feel like other white people don't know the history and they don't realize how much bullshit has actually happened. And I, you know, I think that's part of the reason I feel like it's important to tell stories like Carrie's. And to talk about all of these historical events that were not in my history books. I didn't hear about the Tulsa Race Riot or the Washington riots or the Red Summer. So I don't know.
I feel like the closest thing to a story like that we were ever told when I was a kid was like the integration of schools.
Yeah. Well, it was like Rosa Parks and MLK marching. Yeah.
But it was never, oh, let's talk about that summer when.
Yeah. But, you know, they also don't talk about how a lot of Black activists in the civil rights era were also like heavily stalked by the FBI.
Oh, yeah.
And
absolutely.
some of them were assassinated. Like, we don't really talk about that, do we? We don't really talk about how like it was our own organizations, our own governments. It was the police. And we talk about the audience. Maybe you remember that episode on Lucy Parsons. I don't know if you know about her, Amelia. But like, she is this epic labor activist and quote anarchist, because that was the Labor Party back then, was the anarchist party. But like her office is getting burned down and shit, and like the FBI had like this whole huge case file against her, and that's the shit we gotta keep talking about.
They want you to toe the line.
Well, I'm not towing the line.
Me neither.
You know, and we're not towing the line on this podcast.
Exactly.
So thank you for joining me for this dark chapter, but on an excellent broad, who defended herself and thank goodness had some great supporters to help her through it. I couldn't even imagine if like the Reverend hadn't been there and that defense lawyer, like what would have happened to her. I don't even know.
Yeah.
But there's angels there like throughout history too. So it's cool to acknowledge those folks too.
Absolutely. Well, I'll come back on anytime.
Love having you. And thank you for being here, Amelia. To learn more about Carrie Johnson, see pictures of her and quotes from this episode, head on over to broadsyoushouldknow.com. While you're there, you can click on over to the About page and read more about me and Amelia. Our bios, photos, links to all of our cool stuff, all right there. Are you following Broads You Should Know on social yet? We are on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube now at Broads You Should Know, and Twitter at BYSK Podcast. To suggest a broad, fill out the form on our website or email us at broadsyoushouldknow@gmail.com. If you are a fan of this podcast, help spread the word about us. Share an episode with your friends or family, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You also can give us listens, likes, and comments on YouTube now. Broads You Should Know is produced by me, Sarah Gorski, and edited by Chloe Sky, with original music by Darren Callahan. Finally, if you were really intrigued with the story about Carrie Johnson, I highly suggest that you check out a few of our other activist broads. We've got Lucy Parsons, Merle Evers, Polly Murray, Dorothy Bolden, and Ella Jo Baker. See you next week for another Broad You Should Know.